Today we're going to be showing you how to create your own piping. And to do this, you're going to need some fabric of your choice, some cording, an acrylic ruler, a rotary cutter, and a cutting mat to cut on, some fabric clips, and a sewing machine with a cording foot. The first step of creating piping is cutting fabric strips. There are two ways that you can cut fabric strips: either straight strips or bias strips. Bias cutting is cut at a 45-degree angle from the warp, which is the length of the roll, or the weft, which is the width of the roll. You would want to make your piping with bias strips when using some upholstery fabrics because the bias will have more stretch than the warp or weft. We've cut out two strips to make this a little bit more obvious. So this strip was cut from the warp of the material, which makes it a straight cut strip. And as you can see, there's not a lot of stretch to it. This strip was cut from the bias of the material, which makes it a bias strip. And as you can see, there's a lot more stretch to it. There are some fabrics that you would want to have straight strips for piping. If you're using a material with stripes, you'll want to cut along those stripes to match your pattern. So we would recommend cutting straight strips for this piece. And if you're using a material with a four-way stretch like this vinyl, you can cut straight strips since the stretch is along the warp and along the weft of the fabric, so you wouldn't need the bias stretch. Now, if you're using a material other than that, we would still recommend cutting along a 45-degree bias. Since we're going to be using an upholstery fabric, we're going to be cutting along the bias. We can use our acrylic ruler to make sure that we have a 45-degree angle, and then we can cut the corner off our fabric so that we're going to have a straight edge to work with. So once we have this straight edge, we're going to measure our strips. And we recommend a width of 1 3/4 inches. This will just guarantee that there's enough fabric to sew through when applying our piping to our application later. So if your fabric is longer than your ruler, you can always double up your fabric and cut that way. So go ahead and cut as many strips as you're going to need for your application. We've just cut a few for our example today. Now with our strips cut out, we're going to sew them together to create one long strip of fabric to use. There are two different approaches to sewing your strips together, which can depend on what kind of strip you cut. If you cut straight strips, you can simply lie the two strips on top of each other with the right side of the fabric facing each other and then sew them together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you're using a fabric with stripes like this one, you're going to want those stripes to line up before you sew them together. Since we've cut our fabric on the bias, we're going to be sewing our strips together using the second method. To do this, first lay one strip on top of the other with the right side of the fabric facing up on both. Then cut the edges of the fabric off at a 45-degree angle. Next, we're going to flip the top one up so that the wrong side is facing up on that strip, and the bottom strip still has the right side facing up. Line up these strips along the 45-degree angle and leaving a little excess hanging out on either side. Once you have them properly lined up, clip or pin them together. And we're going to show you the same steps again for the next strip. With all of our strips clipped together, we're going to take them over to our sewing machine. We're going to sew them together with about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once the first strip is sewn, you can slide your next one in and continue sewing. Once all your pieces are sewn together, you can remove them and cut the thread ends. Now to sew the cording into the fabric, start by folding a small section of cording into the fabric strip. Make sure that the fabric is equal on the top and bottom so that neither edge hangs over the piping more than the other. Then place the fabric under the foot so that the cording lies in the foot's built-in groove. The great thing about Sailrite's cording feet is that you can just guide the piping and fabric into place and the foot will do the rest. When you get to a seam in the strip of your fabric, open it up and flatten the fabric for the piping to lay on. This will just help reduce bulk. Then continue sewing until you have all the piping that you'll need. And that's really all there is to making your own custom piping to perfectly match any upholstery project. We've linked all the tools and materials that we've used in the description below, so if you're interested, make sure to check those out. And if you want to see more helpful videos on DIYs and products, make sure to subscribe to our channel so that you'll stay up to date on all of our latest videos.